I have had a 25-year opportunity to have an amazing career in which I have worked with some really talented educators and social service workers and business people. During that time, I myself was an educator. I left there to go work in the mental health field, and after that spent some time trying to eradicate poverty. And most recently, I've gotten to spend some time learning about and sharing with others the impact of trauma on the brain. You see, I've learned that in order to teach something, I need to dig really deep into it. And I need to understand it at really great depth so that I understand the stats, and I understand the statistics and figures, and I understand all of those things that are the factual pieces, so that when I take it to other people, I can make it real for them and understand how it impacts their world and then bring it to life. And I have had the opportunity for the past 4 years to dig really deep into the impact of trauma and adversity on the brain. And so today what I'd like to do is to share with you a piece of what I've learned and to give you some hope. What I'd like to share with you today is a topic called adverse childhood experiences. Those things that happen to us before we turn the age of 18 that make a template on how we see the world and that impact our brains in such a way that when we interact with the world, oftentimes it's out of that adversity. Two researchers, Dr. Vincent Folletti and Dr. Robert Anda, did lots of work in this area. And they actually created a 10-question questionnaire that they gave out to 18,000 people. And what they were looking for was, what is the impact of adversity in childhood on later in life physical health outcomes? I'll tell you that what they found was astonishing and remarkable, and sometimes it shakes my core to think about. Because what they found was a strong dose-response correlation between the amount of adversity that we face as children and our later in life physical health outcomes. They were able to actually identify the fact that through that adversity, our bodies and our chemistry and our brains are changed in such a way that if you have experienced 4 or more adverse childhood experiences, your lifespan could be shortened by 20 years. So when I say the word adverse childhood experiences, or as I'll probably shorten it now to ACEs, what do I mean? When we talk about ACEs, they asked questions that were in groups of physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, your parents being divorced, growing up in a home with someone with mental illness, growing up in a home with someone who was substance abusing, or growing up in a home where you witnessed domestic violence and felt unsafe. When they looked at the results of those 18,000 questionnaires, they found that people who had not experienced adversity in childhood, which I'll note was only about a third of people, actually long-term showed almost no sign of any disease. But as soon as you had experienced one adverse childhood experience, your risk for any physical health impairment started to increase. At the point that you've had 4 or more ACEs, you're actually 232% more likely to have a heart attack than someone who has had none. When you've experienced 4 or more ACEs, you are 285% more likely to have heart disease than someone who has experienced none. And the one that always takes my breath a little bit is that if you have experienced 4 or more ACEs, you are 354% more likely to have a vision issue than someone who has had no ACEs. As you look at the questionnaire that Anda and Folletti created and their results, which you can find at cdc.gov, and you begin to consider the impact of all of the diseases that they were able to make a correlation between ACEs and that outcome, it can become a pretty gruesome story. And it can be a little overwhelming, I'll be honest. Because while they looked at the physical health impact, we've also had researchers out there who have looked at the impact on the brain. Because you see, when you experience that kind of adversity day after day after day after day, your brain does what your brain was wired to do, and that's to survive. But the way that your brain does that is that it goes into its mechanism called fight, flight, freeze response. And when somebody grows up in an unsafe neighborhood, or has parents who are substance abusing or mentally ill or are domestically violent, when they're abused and neglected, the brain gets hijacked and it gets stuck in this fight, flight, freeze mode. It creates a template for the entire world where you begin to misperceive interaction with other human beings as threat. And when our brains are threatened and they go into fight, flight, freeze mode, we do what we need to do to survive. And oftentimes that's physical violence, that's fleeing the scene and running away, or that's simply shutting down to the point you can't interact anymore. When I learned this information, I couldn't help but reflect on my own life experience and that of many, many, many people that I've known across my career. And I thought about all the people that I had known who had faced great adversity in their lives and made choices to head this direction. And other people who had experienced that same adversity and headed this direction. And I spent many, many, many years pondering, what is it that's at that intersection? What makes the difference? And when I dug really deep into that research, what I found is that the answer at that intersection is resiliency. The good news, if there is some in all of this talk so far, is that resiliency can be built, no matter how much adversity we've been through. And resiliency is the most easily and most effectively built through a loving, caring, nurturing relationship with another human being. Something that we all can do. When I thought about my own adversity in life, I pondered, what was it that put me on this path? Why was it that I was successful? Why did I graduate from college? Why did I meet all the benchmarks that I was supposed to meet? And I reflected upon the numbers and numbers and numbers of people who have invested in me and built resilience. Because you see, to build resilience in someone, the first thing you have to do is just show up. Be present repeatedly and consistently and predictably. You have to see something in them that is of value, and you invest in it. And you teach a skill. And I had so many people who taught me skill. I had teachers, I had coaches, I had family, I had friends, parents, I had coworkers, and yes, even bosses who built incredible resiliency in me. And I'm eternally grateful. Some of those people inspired me so much that I knew that I needed to give back to the world. I became a teacher so that I could give back. And while I may not teach in the classroom every day, I teach all the time. And this year was a little bit different. Because while I've spent those 4 years looking deeply at trauma and educating people wherever I go, and talking to teachers and talking to social service workers and talking to business people about all that information, this year, I had the opportunity to be the student. Because I had the opportunity that was career-changing. And I went into an elementary school where my job there was to educate teachers and the staff about trauma, and then to coach side by side with teachers on a weekly basis on how to become trauma-informed, how to create environments that were sensitive to the adversity that students had been through. And I met Mrs. Smith, an amazing third-grade teacher who did everything that I asked of her as a coach, who created an amazing room that was very trauma-informed, very sensitive to students' needs, doing well academically, and a place that I would want to be. And I was impressed. I'm not going to lie. And I was a bit in awe at her ability to create that climate and that culture. But my life was impacted when I saw the effect of what she did on 26 kids. You see, every day, Mrs. Smith would walk into that room, and she knew that her first and foremost job was to create predictability and safety. And she created a climate where it was okay to make mistakes, where it was okay to take risks. Every day she did the same morning routine. Every day she did movement to get the kids engaged. Every day she sent the same messages over and over and over. She created a space where they could share their fears, where they could share their excitements, where they could share their feelings. And where from both of us they continually heard words like, it's a new day tomorrow, we'll try again, let's work together to solve that problem. You're welcome here. I want you here. You're a part of our community. And I watched those students who had come from incredible adversity, who had hair triggers, who were so angry and oftentimes shutting down, begin to relax into the predictability and the safety and the nurturing that she created. While I watched that happen for 26 kids, I want to tell you about one specific young man that I watched. And I watched the impact of her approach on a young man named Drew. You see, when Drew was a first grader, he was suspended for 45 days, mostly for fighting. And as a second grader, he was suspended 30 days. Again, mostly for fighting. And when Mrs. Smith met Drew that first day, she made sure that he knew, you're welcome here, and I love you, and we're going to get through this together. And day after day after day, she sent him that message. And when I got to come into the room, I had to ride Mrs. Smith's credibility with those kids. Because who am I? And to Drew, who sat in the back of the room with a surly eye at me and who was incredibly suspicious of my intentions, he didn't warm up to me right away. And as I rode that credibility and I kept showing up and I kept being present, after 11 visits, Drew finally let me look at his paper on his desk. And on my 15th visit, he came up and he stood beside me and he bumped into me before he scurried away. But you see, I knew that day I had won trust. And I had started the ball rolling on relationship. I continued to show up in Mrs. Smith's room, and we continued to send those messages as consistently as we possibly could. And I'm happy to say, Drew never got suspended in third grade. And that didn't happen by accident. That happened because somebody showed up every day and loved him consistently and loved all of those kids. At the end of the year, Drew was having a really hard time leaving. He knew over the summer he wouldn't get to see his adult people like he had every day of school. And he was struggling. And I was there one of the last days, and I was walking around the room, and I was helping some students, and I was talking to a young man and looking at his paper. And the next thing I know, Drew climbs on a chair and onto my back. And he wrapped his legs around me, kind of like 4-year-olds do, except he wasn't 4, he was a big 9-year-old. And he wrapped his legs around me, and he put his arms around my neck, and he just hung there. And pretty soon he started to engage with the young man that I was looking at his paper, and they started to talk, and he just continued to hang there. And it was time to go to gym, and I walked down to the gym with him hanging on my back that way. And of course, some administrators who saw me in the hall were a little taken aback, and then they noticed who was carrying him and just waved, and, oh, it's that crazy trauma-informed lady, it'll be okay. And later, one of those administrators came to me and she said, Carol, that was Drew trying to love you, wasn't it? Yes. That was Drew's hug. Because you see, no matter how much relationship I built with Drew, it was never okay to give a hug. And I knew that day that that was Drew's hug. As I left that day, I knew that my career and my life had been changed. And I have no doubt that Drew's life was impacted by Mrs. Smith this year. And I know that Mrs. Smith's life was impacted by Drew. And I know that my life was changed by both of them. As I continue forward into other schools and I do other trainings, I do it for that. Because I watched what could happen for kids like Drew when they get a room in a school that wants them there and doesn't cast them aside for behavior that's challenging. I watched them welcome him and other students like him every day. And I watched them say, we want you here and you're part of our community. And I hope that as Drew and his 26 peers step out this summer and the world grabs them and tries to pull them in 1,000 directions, for just one moment, they remember that they are lovable and that they are worthy and they have enough resilience to resist that. Because that is a world that I want to live in. And those are schools that all of us should want. Thank you.